Washington's silent retaliation, the strategic paralysis behind 3 weeks of inaction. On the morning of March 16th, the White House issued a statement that left no room for interpretive ambiguity. The United States would respond to the Houthi strike on the USS Carney with overwhelming force within a matter of hours, not days. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin appeared before cameras at 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time and stated that military assets were already positioned, targets had been identified, and retaliation was imminent. 3 weeks have now passed. Not a single retaliatory strike has been executed. The gap between that public commitment and the operational silence that followed represents something far more significant than bureaucratic delay or tactical recalibration. It represents a strategic paralysis that has profound implications for deterrence frameworks across multiple theaters of conflict. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications, because the pace at which the operational picture is diverging from official communications means you cannot afford to be behind this analysis when the next development breaks. What happened in the 3 weeks between Washington's retaliation promise and the present moment is not simply a story about military hesitation. It is a story about the collision between public deterrence commitments and private strategic calculations that have fundamentally altered how regional actors assess American willingness to enforce red lines. You need this analysis before the next crisis point arrives, because the pattern being established here will determine how adversaries calibrate their actions across the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Taiwan Strait. To understand the full weight of what this 3-week silence actually means, it is necessary to first understand what the USS Carney incident represented to the Pentagon's broader maritime security framework in the region, because this was not a minor harassment operation against commercial shipping. It was a direct kinetic engagement against a United States Navy warship operating under explicit force protection protocols in international waters. The Carney is an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, one of 73 vessels in the class that form the backbone of American surface combat capability. These destroyers carry Aegis combat systems capable of tracking more than 100 simultaneous targets, vertical launch systems housing 96 missile cells, and defensive suites specifically designed to defeat the exact threat profile that Houthi forces employed in the March 16th engagement. The attack itself involved 17 anti-ship cruise missiles launched in 3 successive waves over a period of 42 minutes. According to tactical data released through unofficial channels and confirmed by multiple defense analysts with access to regional surveillance networks, the first wave consisted of 6 missiles approaching from Yemen's western coastline at an altitude of approximately 50 meters above sea level. The Carney's Aegis system detected all 6 missiles at a range of 68 nautical miles and successfully engaged 4 of them with SM-2 interceptors. 2 missiles penetrated the defensive envelope and required last resort engagement from the ship's close-in weapon system, the Phalanx CIWS, which destroyed both missiles at a range of less than 1,000 meters from the hull. The second wave arrived 14 minutes later with 7 missiles employing a different approach vector from the northeast, forcing the Carney to reorient its defensive posture while simultaneously conducting damage assessment on expended interceptor inventory. 5 of those 7 missiles were destroyed. 2 achieved terminal guidance lock before being intercepted at ranges that Pentagon officials have declined to specify publicly, but which multiple sources describe as inside the threshold that qualifies as critical proximity. The third wave never arrived at the Carney. Those 4 remaining missiles were reportedly diverted mid-flight toward a Panamanian flag container vessel operating 23 nautical miles west of the destroyer's position. That civilian vessel, the MSC Orion, sustained 2 direct hits that killed 11 crew members and rendered the ship's engine room completely inoperable. The vessel is still adrift in the southern Red Sea 3 weeks later, waiting for salvage operations that insurance underwriters have so far declined to authorize due to continued threat assessments in the operating area. Here is where the retaliation calculus becomes extraordinarily complex. And here is where Washington's 3-week silence begins to make a certain kind of sense that has nothing to do with military capability and everything to do with strategic consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tactical exchange. The Pentagon possesses overwhelming capacity to execute retaliatory strikes against Houthi launch sites, weapons depots, command facilities, and radar installations throughout Yemen. That capacity has never been in question. What has been in question from the moment Austin made his public commitment is whether such retaliation produces strategic outcomes that improve American positioning or whether it accelerates dynamics that Washington is desperately trying to contain. If the analysis this channel provides is giving you the kind of breakdown that explains mechanisms rather than just reporting events, subscribe now and share this video with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening behind the daily headline cycle. When the next commitment gets made and the next timeline passes without action, when the next adversary tests the credibility of American deterrent statements, the analysis will be here documenting the gap between official characterization and operational reality. The first constraint preventing retaliation is the Saudi factor, and this constraint operates at multiple levels simultaneously. Saudi Arabia negotiated a ceasefire with Houthi forces in April of last year, after 8 years of direct military conflict that cost Riyadh an estimated $270 billion and achieved precisely zero of its stated military objectives. That ceasefire has held, albeit imperfectly, for 11 months. Saudi officials have communicated through diplomatic and intelligence channels that American strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen would almost certainly trigger Houthi retaliation against Saudi oil infrastructure, potentially including the kind of drone and missile strikes that successfully hit Abqaiq processing facilities in September 2019. Those strikes temporarily removed 50% of Saudi oil production from global markets and sent Brent crude prices up by nearly 20% in a single trading session. The Abqaiq attack demonstrated that Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, despite billions invested in defensive systems, remains fundamentally vulnerable to the kind of saturation attacks that Houthi forces have proven capable of executing. The Saudis have made it absolutely clear to Washington that they will not support, facilitate, or tolerate American military operations against the Houthis that might jeopardize the ceasefire that Riyadh worked for years to achieve. The United States operates significant intelligence and logistics infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. American access to Saudi airspace and Saudi cooperation on regional intelligence sharing is essential to multiple ongoing operations across the Middle East. Conducting strikes against the Houthis over Saudi objections would fundamentally damage that relationship at a moment when Washington can ill afford additional complications in the Gulf. The second constraint is the Iran escalation pathway, and this constraint has become substantially more acute in the 3 weeks since Austin's retaliation statement. Houthi forces operate with direct Iranian military support, including weapon systems, technical training, intelligence sharing, and strategic coordination. Striking Houthi positions in Yemen means striking capabilities that Iran has invested heavily in developing as part of its broader regional influence architecture. Multiple intelligence assessments circulating among defense policy analysts suggest that Iran has communicated through back channels that American strikes in Yemen would trigger Iranian responses that extend beyond Yemen's borders. The specific nature of those threatened responses has not been publicly disclosed, but the pattern of Iranian signaling suggests potential targeting of American forces in Iraq and Syria, where approximately 2,500 troops remain deployed in exposed positions with limited force protection infrastructure. Iran has demonstrated both capability and willingness to strike American positions when it calculates that escalation risks are manageable. The January 2020 missile strikes against Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq, conducted in retaliation for the Soleimani assassination, involved 11 ballistic missiles that caused traumatic brain injuries to more than 100 American personnel, despite advance warning that allowed partial evacuation. That attack established a template for Iranian retaliation that falls below the threshold, triggering automatic American military response while still inflicting meaningful costs. The Pentagon's assessment, according to multiple sources familiar with internal deliberations, is that striking the Houthis creates an escalation sequence that could rapidly expand to include direct Iranian attacks on American forces across multiple countries, potentially creating casualties that would generate domestic political pressure for even larger retaliatory operations against Iran itself. That escalation pathway leads directly to the third constraint, which is the most significant and the least discussed in mainstream coverage. The United States military is not currently postured to fight a sustained conflict with Iran, while simultaneously maintaining its commitments in Europe related to Ukraine and its force projection requirements in the Pacific related to Taiwan contingency planning. This is not a question of whether American forces could defeat Iranian military capabilities in a direct conventional conflict. That outcome is not in serious doubt among military planners. The question is whether the United States can afford the operational disruption, the economic consequences and the strategic opportunity costs that such a conflict would generate at this particular moment in the broader competitive landscape with China and Russia. The economic consequences of American military action in Yemen that triggers broader regional conflict extend far beyond the immediate theater and into the daily economic reality of people in countries with no direct involvement in Middle Eastern geopolitics. And understanding the specific mechanisms by which this potential escalation generates those consequences is essential to understanding why Washington has remained silent for 3 weeks, despite repeated public commitments to respond with overwhelming force. The Red Sea handles approximately 12% of global trade volume and 30% of global container traffic. Approximately 5.2 million barrels of oil per day transit through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. Disruption to that traffic flow has immediate impacts on energy prices, shipping costs, and the insurance mathematics that determine whether commercial vessels are willing to operate in contested waters. In the 3 weeks since the Carney incident, marine insurance rates for Red Sea transits have increased by 380%, according to data compiled by maritime insurance brokers in London. That increase is not a temporary spike. It represents a fundamental recalculation of risk exposure based on demonstrated Houthi capability to strike both military and civilian vessels with advanced anti-ship missiles. Those insurance costs get passed directly to shippers, who pass them to importers, who pass them to retailers, who pass them to consumers. The average American household will pay an additional $47 per month in increased costs for imported goods if current insurance rates persist through the second quarter, according to economic modeling conducted by supply chain analysts at the National Retail Federation. That figure represents a direct household impact from a conflict most Americans cannot locate on a map and a retaliation decision that Washington has so far declined to execute. If American strikes against the Houthis trigger broader regional conflict that closes the Bab el-Mandeb Strait entirely, even temporarily, the economic consequences scale dramatically. Shipping that currently transits the Red Sea would be forced to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding approximately 3,500 nautical miles and 12 to 14 days to transit times between Asia and Europe. That rerouting increases fuel costs, extends supply chain timelines, and creates capacity constraints that drive up freight rates across the entire global shipping network. Goldman Sachs economic analysis projects that complete closure of Red Sea shipping lanes for 30 days would add approximately 1.2% to global inflation rates and reduce global GDP growth by 0.3% for the full year. Those are not abstract macroeconomic statistics. They translate to measurable reductions in household purchasing power, increased unemployment in manufacturing sectors dependent on just-in-time supply chains, and broader economic instability that carries political consequences for governments across multiple continents. The oil price impact would be even more immediate and severe. Closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait would force approximately 5 million barrels per day of oil exports to find alternative routes or alternative buyers. That disruption would likely add $20 to $35 per barrel to Brent crude prices within the first week, according to energy market analysts. At current consumption rates, that translates to an additional $1.20 per gallon at American gas pumps and substantially higher increases in European markets that are more dependent on Middle Eastern oil supplies. The average American household consumes approximately 50 gallons of gasoline per month. A $1.20 per gallon increase represents $60 per month in additional fuel costs alone, before accounting for increased costs on all other goods that depend on petroleum inputs for production and transportation. These economic calculations are not occurring in isolation at the Pentagon. They are being presented to senior officials as part of the retaliation decision-making process. The question being asked is not whether the United States military can strike Houthi positions in Yemen. The question being asked is whether doing so creates economic and strategic consequences that are worse than tolerating the attack on the Khani without kinetic response. That question has apparently been answered, at least for the past 3 weeks, in a way that prioritizes economic stability and escalation avoidance over the demonstration of military resolve. The broader strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is the one that defense analysts across the ideological spectrum are beginning to ask with increasing urgency. Has deterrence itself become fundamentally unaffordable for the United States? The traditional model of American deterrence depended on the credible threat that attacks on American interests would trigger overwhelming military retaliation, regardless of broader strategic context. That model functioned effectively when the United States possessed undisputed military superiority, faced adversaries with limited escalation options, and operated in an economic environment where regional conflicts had minimal impact on global supply chains. None of those conditions remain fully operative today. China has developed military capabilities that pose genuine anti-access challenges in the Western Pacific. Russia has demonstrated willingness to accept extraordinary costs in Ukraine while maintaining escalation threats through its nuclear arsenal. Iran has built regional proxy networks that create multiple simultaneous escalation pathways. And the global economy has become so interconnected through just-in-time supply chains and concentrated choke point dependencies that regional conflicts instantly generate worldwide economic consequences. In this environment, the old deterrence model that promised automatic retaliation has collided with a new strategic reality where every military action carries cascading risks that must be carefully calculated against potential benefits. The Houthi forces that attacked the Khani understand this dynamic perfectly. They have calibrated their operations to inflict meaningful costs on American interests while remaining below the threshold that triggers the kind of retaliation that Austin promised. They struck a military vessel, not a civilian target. They inflicted damage and forced defensive expenditure, but they did not kill American sailors. They demonstrated capability to challenge American naval presence in waters Washington considers critical to global commerce, but they did not close the strait or create the kind of mass casualty event that would make retaliation politically unavoidable. This is sophisticated strategic thinking that exploits the gap between American declaratory policy and American operational willingness to accept escalation risks and economic costs. Other regional actors are watching this 3-week silence with extraordinary attention. Hezbollah forces in Lebanon are observing how Washington responds when American military assets are directly engaged. Iranian military planners are updating their assessments of American red lines based on demonstrated tolerance for attacks that would have triggered immediate retaliation in previous decades. Chinese strategists are noting the constraints that prevent American action even when public commitments have been explicitly made. The message being received across multiple theaters is that American deterrence statements carry significantly less credibility than the rhetoric suggests. That message creates incentives for additional probing operations designed to test American willingness to enforce stated red lines across multiple regions simultaneously. The USS Carney remains on station in the Red Sea, its missile magazines partially depleted, its crew maintaining alert status against additional attacks that intelligence assessments suggest are being actively planned. The ship has not been reinforced with additional destroyers despite the demonstrated threat environment. American force posture in the region has not meaningfully changed in the 3 weeks since Austin's retaliation promise. No targets have been struck. No capabilities have been degraded. No costs have been imposed on the forces that executed 17 missile attacks against a United States Navy warship operating in international waters. Here is where the complete picture stands 21 days after Washington promised overwhelming retaliation within hours. The Houthis successfully engaged an American destroyer, forced the expenditure of expensive interceptor missiles, demonstrated that American defensive systems can be saturated by determined attacks, and escaped without any kinetic response whatsoever. The economic costs of Red Sea insecurity continue to accumulate in the form of increased insurance rates, rerouted shipping, and supply chain disruptions that will show up in consumer prices throughout the second quarter. The strategic message being broadcast to adversaries across multiple regions is that American deterrence commitments are subject to complex calculations that can produce extended delays or complete inaction, even when public promises have been explicitly made. And the Pentagon is discovering that maintaining global deterrence credibility while avoiding escalation spirals and economic disruption may have become fundamentally incompatible objectives in the current strategic environment. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. When the next deadline passes, when the next commitment dissolves into diplomatic process and strategic recalculation, when the next adversary tests American willingness to enforce stated red lines with military action, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, what it means for you always. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can deterrence frameworks designed for an era of American military dominance and regional conflict isolation function in an environment where adversaries have multiple escalation pathways and economic interdependence makes every military action globally consequential? Every response gets read. This is where the analysis continues.